Now, Patricia Hernandez has written an article on Polygon, and she's gone over a whole ton of issues surrounding The Last of Us Part 2, but essentially The Last of Us Part 2 has turned into what I would say a political minefield that I don't think anybody really expected. So, with all the articles, I'll leave a link in the description below, but we're going to take some excerpts from all of these articles, and I'll just read some of that now. And this is from Neil Druckmann with this quote. A few hours later, the leak is everywhere, and you're starting to get hate on every social media you're on. And soon that turns into death threats, anti Semitic remarks, and just craziness I never could have anticipated, he continued, stating that he never thought the game would get this sort of hate. It's still visible on social media, where top replies to nearly anything from Naughty Dog will include responses like, "The game is straight garbage." It seems unlikely that these opinions are coming from people who have actually played the game, given that it's impossible to explain how The Last of Us Part 2 could have racked up hundreds of negative user reviews on Metacritic immediately after launch. So, right after launch, we had a critic score of about 96 for The Last of Us Part 2. So a lot of the critics, they overwhelmingly liked the game. However, the user reviews, there are a ton of user reviews. I think it was almost like about 8,000 user reviews that rated the game around an average of 3.4. So basically a ton of people just voted the game as 0. And that there was no way the game could have possibly had 8,000 reviews the moment the game launched, because it's a 20 to 35 hour game, and Sony didn't provide that many number of copies for users to go and play the game and review the game. Not when the game immediately launched anyway. So a lot of it was people already had decided whether the things that were in The Last of Us Part 2 they agreed with or not, and it didn't matter about the quality of the game anymore. They kind of used the game as a political tool to, I guess, espouse their views. And I think if it gets to this type of level, it doesn't make sense anymore. We've seen that with Steam reviews. People just hate on the game, but sometimes that has to do with the quality of the game itself. But it seems with The Last of Us Part 2 anyway, a lot of it has just become political. Most of it is because there are trans characters, and the main character Ellie is a lesbian in this game. So a lot of people have taken sides on this debate. Like, I don't want politics in my games, which is just incredible in 2020 actually. So let's continue. So the article writes, discussion about the survival game also hampered by unusually restrictive embargo guidelines, which included sentences like, do not include any beat-by-beat descriptions of pivotal narrative or cutscenes moments, and do not reveal the fate of any character or the inciting events. This prevented websites from discussing any specifics of the game's story, which was tricky considering that the game reveals something surprising within its first 2 hours that impacts the remainder of its 20 to 30 hour journey. Yeah, so there is also some pushback that the game was too tightly controlled, and there was a lot of, I guess people that wanted to read more from the reviews, or people that were writing the reviews, felt a little bit restricted, and that also created people to just talk about things outside of the amount of stuff that they could talk about. People didn't want to be restricted. They wanted to be free to talk about what they want in the game, especially when, as it says here, that something happened within the first 2 hours, and they couldn't really talk about that because they would spoil a lot of the other parts of the story. And if you're playing this game, I won't be spoiling anything, and this article doesn't spoil anything, so you are safe to discuss to watch this video. So the writer continues, Patricia continues, why go through such lengths, especially when the internet was flooded with half-informed takes and speculation based on what had already leaked? Control. The studio had already gone to great efforts to maintain a tight grip on what folks knew about the experience. As Kotaku reported, Naughty Dog at one point showed a fake scene during a trailer to make people believe that a character would be more present in the game than they actually were. So this could be because somebody died, I'm not sure, but I don't think we can really insinuate that they were trying to fake the fact that this character could have been in the game more because he was in a scene in the trailer. So I don't think we can insinuate that. So I don't quite agree with that. But I do agree with the part where it says maybe there was perhaps a little bit too much control over what people could write. I think there is an issue with games itself if you're going to put a spoiler in the first couple of hours, because that's going to affect how people talk about the game, and we see this in forums a lot where people have spoiler tags on basically almost everything that they're writing. So it becomes like an entire forum with just spoiler tag stuff that is uninteresting to read. So I think that in itself, Naughty Dog maybe should think about how they go and present the narrative. Even though I know they want full narrative control and creative freedom over their game, they probably should know that if they put a spoiler at the start of the game, nobody can really talk about it, and that's going to be a problem for the game itself. Now, Patricia goes on to write, on June 12th, Vice published a review of The Last of Us Part 2, in which critic Rob Zacny said that while the game had memorable moments that made for great spectacle, he was less taken with the story and characters. According to Zacny, Vice's review prompted a Sony representative to reach out on behalf of Naughty Dog. They felt some of the conclusions I reached in my review were unfair and dismissed some meaningful changes or improvements, Zacny told Polygon over Twitter messages. I was happy to unpack a bit of my reasoning, however, and received a perfectly cordial message in response, Zacny said. So, you know, this one actually really surprised me, that Sony would actually contact the reviewer over this review, especially when at the time, I actually told the reviewer, Rob, on Twitter that he wrote a great review and it was well written, and he responded back with thank you. So, I mean, I wrote this and said, and so this is his review right here. And I'll just read a little bit of it out. There is a common saying that if you seek revenge, you should dig 2 graves. Playing The Last of Us Part 2 is like being made to dig those graves with your teeth. It is over 24 hours of spiraling cycles of violence and vengeance, being reminded roughly every hour that the whole endeavor is squalid and cruel. There is hardly a moment of joy it will not eventually curdle. A truly shocking number of characters that you will come to care about will be gruesomely mutilated or slaughtered or both. All of it is utterly predictable, or if you're feeling charitable, tragically fated. So when I read this review, and you can go read the rest of it yourself, I just felt like this was an extremely well written review, and a lot of what he's saying isn't a negative, wasn't anything negative against the game. He didn't actually hate the game. He just felt like it probably wasn't for him. For him, it was really tough to play a game where he says the whole endeavor is squalid and cruel. He just didn't want to play a cruel game where you're killing people with really brutal weapons. And that's the kind of take that I felt like when I watched the trailer, that the violence was over the line, and that's clearly Naughty Dog's intention, right? To cross the line to make you feel disturbed about the violence. And for Rob, it was just a little bit too much for Rob, I think, given reading his review. And I thought that was a perfectly fine take. So I feel like when they say Sony contacted Rob about the review, I hope it was more because of, hey, did you hate the review? Did you hate the game? Or did you just find that it wasn't for him? And hopefully, you know, Sony understands that it probably wasn't for him. Now, I don't want to think that Sony want to control all of the reviews. And that was the point that I touched earlier on in my previous video. I've done a video on this, the issues with game reviews, and you can check that on my channel. And I posted that last week. When there's so much control over reviews, Sony is trying to frame the game in a sense that will drive more sales. And that's not what criticism is about. Criticism is about discussing the game and analyzing the game for what it makes you feel. And that's what Rob was doing. He wasn't bashing the game. He just felt like it was too hard for him because he wasn't in that space.